I'm an organizer with BAMN, but I'm also a son of immigrants. My parents are immigrated here from the Philippines because they wanted a better life. I'm also a gay person too. And I'm here today because I know with Trump, who's attacking everyone's rights, that the power, the way to defeat Donald Trump is so strong, and it's in the immigrant community.
That's right.
Donald Trump, the center of his divide and conquer racist stupidity, is his racist attacks on immigrants. If he can attack immigrants, he will attack all of us. And we are saying no to that.
The resistance to Trump anti-fascism in America has begun with the fight to stop Trump's mass deportations. We need to rise up to defend democracy. This is the video I said I would make after Trump's election, but I was delayed by political work and legal work. And as it turns out, this delay was for the better. Since then, Trump has started to come up against real obstacles, and what my organization BAMN has been predicting, and what we've said is key to defeat Trump's fascist presidency, mass resistance for immigrant rights, has begun. Marches have been springing up in cities across the country, in scores of cities. Here's some video from Phoenix, and from Los Angeles, and from Oakland. And oh, hey, that's me. It's Ronald, the rules lawyer. And as I said already in my coming out video, which you should see if you want a more personal perspective of who I am and why I got into politics, and generally what my group BAMN is about, while my channel is a tabletop RPG channel and politics isn't its focus, it is the focus of me. On extraordinary occasions, I will make a political video. After all, our hobby, which is becoming increasingly diverse, is affected by the broader world, including by racism, sexism, homophobia, transphobia, and now also a trade war that Trump has provoked against China that's going to increase the cost of producing and shipping tabletop RPGs and other games. This is a very important time to make a video, and get ready. If my previous coming out video was a faucet, then today's video is a fire hose. If you're hesitating to watch right now, I would encourage you to watch because our collective future is at stake. Also, I'll announce that the way history is going, I probably will launch a new channel. One that gives me more space to do more political videos and presentations and interviews and other things I think of. My own Ronald Maddow show. So subscribe to this channel and also join my Discord community, and I'll let you know if and when that launches. My initial plan for this video from a month ago was actually to begin by answering the pushback that I got by some people for calling Elon Musk a fascist, for saying that he wants to do what fascism does, to add to his own indescribable economic power, direct tyrannical power over the state. It made more sense then to start there when the question was more abstract, but since then I have been proven right. He has been rightly criticized for personally trying to take over the government, given the Nazi salute, and addressed a far-right rally in Germany with this statement.
Elon Musk's surprise speech at a far-right party rally in Germany is causing uproar today.
I think there's frankly too much of a focus on past guilt, and we need to move beyond that.
The German crowd cheered as Musk urged them to set aside guilt over the Nazis and the Holocaust.
Children should not be guilty of the sins of their parents.
If by now someone still denies that Elon Musk is a fascist or that Trump is a fascist, someone who is openly racist, who spurns the rule of law, who just pardoned people who he led to try to overthrow a constitutional election, who see themselves as extra-legal enforcers of his will, just like the SS and SA in Germany, if you're still denying they're fascist in order to quiet opposition to them, then frankly, I'm not addressing you. I will address what fascism is in this video, and here's an outline of the plan for this video, but I'm addressing the people who already know that something dangerous is happening and that something needs to be done about it, and to say that if we act, we can win. Today, I'm basically sharing my perspective as a now 29-year-long organizer with the civil rights group BAMN, which stands for the Coalition to Defend Affirmative Action, Integration, and Immigrant Rights, and Fight for Equality by Any Means Necessary. BAMN stands for By Any Means Necessary. If you want to organize marches, walkouts, resistance, contact us, or me. We need to build a national organization of leaders for the new civil rights and immigrant rights movement. Because the majority of Americans oppose fascism and are looking for a perspective and a leadership with a plan of what to do. but who are being misled currently by the Democratic Party and the establishment liberal organizations, which are making the same kinds of mistakes and giving the same bad advice that led to Hitler's rise with little opposition in Germany. This will be a long video, but I did my damnedest to condense my nearly 30 years of political experience to explain what is going on in the US and the world today and how we can affect it. We'll be looking back at history and looking at current events also. And while I was planning this, I had to constantly add to my plan because there were new things happening every day. I've added video chapters for your convenience so you can navigate, or if you need to step away, you can find your place when you come back. I've also been told that my videos are kind of like podcasts. You can listen while you're cleaning the house or marching. First, I want to open by talking about what we can learn from Frederick Douglass, the great abolitionist leader against slavery. Fascism has come to America, not in the form of an immediate transformation of our traditional constitutional institutions into fascist Italy or Nazi Germany, with a legal one-man dictatorship and the wholesale elimination of elections. We don't have that. But Mussolini and Hitler did not achieve their fascist transformations of their nation states overnight. There was a years-long process of transition in which the main, quote-unquote, respectable electoral parties, mainstream journalists, and leading intellectuals of their time, in various ways stuck their heads in the sand and did not make a serious fight against the fascist danger. Where we're at in the US right now is at the beginning phase of a fascist transition and transformation. Fascism is still weak and can be relatively easily defeated compared to the Nazis in Germany in 1933 when Hitler was appointed chancellor. Trump is not all powerful, and history, including American history, has a rich tradition of the masses of people overthrowing tyranny from the American Revolution forward. Frederick Douglass was a former slave who escaped to freedom, and the abolitionist movement sheltered him from slave catchers who were his day's ICE kidnappers. He rose to become the most important leader of the abolitionist movement, which succeeded at destroying slavery itself. And he said this in a speech just months after the US Supreme Court declared that a black man has no rights that a white man need respect. A decision that was supposed to settle the question of slavery forever, but in fact accelerated the process of mass radicalization and polarization in the country that led to the Civil War and the destruction of slavery. He said, "The whole history of the progress of human liberty shows that all concessions yet made to her august claims have been born of earnest struggle. If there is no struggle, there is no progress. Those who profess to favor freedom and yet deprecate agitation are men who want crops without plowing up the ground. They want rain without thunder and lightning. They want the ocean without the awful roar of its many waters. This struggle may be a moral one, or it may be a physical one, and it may be both moral and physical, but it must be a struggle. Power concedes nothing without a demand. It never did, and it never will." He knew that the oppressed have power, and he continues in his speech. He says, "Find out just what a people will submit to, and you have found the exact amount of injustice and wrong which will be imposed upon them. And these will continue till they are resisted with either words or blows, or with both. The limits of tyrants are prescribed by the endurance of those whom they oppress." In contrast, the Democratic Party leadership and liberal news media have gone out of their way to emphasize that Trump has all the power, and that all we can do is bring lawsuits or stage symbolic protests or vote in the next election for them, and make arguments to Trump voters. They might call protests, but those are their main aims, and the protests that they call are far smaller than they could be, spread out, containable by them, and ultimately symbolic, as opposed to exercising our mass power resisting Trump's fascism. They're committing the same mistake that the opposition made in the 1930s in Germany of not seriously fighting the fascists and what they're doing. Congressman Jamie Raskin appeared on the Rachel Maddow show a couple days ago, talking about Trump's unprecedented attack on civil servants. In this clip I'm about to show you, Rachel Maddow asks him what else can be done to protect civil servants. And he rules out a national mobilization in Washington, D.C., where Trump is at, something that the Democratic Party and the liberal establishment groups can easily call and fund. But listen specifically to what he says.
Congressman, you're talking about civil service law and lawsuits to try to protect civil servants being one of the fronts on which the opposition can proceed. What are you seeing as the other potential fronts on which the opposition can advance in very short notice?
Popular protest is going to become very important here, and it's going to look very different from the first Trump administration. Everybody remembers, 1 million people gathering for the Women's March, and I have no doubt we could get at least that many, if not 5 million. But we also know that Donald Trump has just pardoned 1,500 Proud Boys, Oath Keepers, violent insurrectionists, cop assaulters. And so we don't want a huge protest like that to become a magnet for right-wing provocateurs and violence. Donald Trump would love nothing more than to send in the police and to, stage some kind of, declare martial law or something in a situation like that. But I think the decentralized local protests around particular departments, particular agencies, in particular towns and cities are going to proliferate.
So Raskin's position is not that there is not massive hatred and opposition of Trump and what he's doing. He's not saying we cannot get a lot of people in Washington, D.C. He's saying we can get a lot of people to D.C. and that would be disastrous. It's an absurd position. If we get 5 million people to D.C., which he sounds confident we can, and actually we probably can, it would be the largest march in United States history, and it would set in motion mass resistance to Trump in the United States and across the world. And how successful will the lawsuits Raskin's talking about be in front of Trump's Supreme Court in the absence of mass protest? The Supreme Court in D.C., where he will not mobilize people. And let's be real, there almost certainly would not be a handful of crazies that attack a crowd of 5 million people. If any were stupid enough to try, 1, they would fail, and 2, if anyone were harmed, it would be like the George Floyd movement, where violence provoked worldwide outrage and mass protest. It would be the classic situation seen over and over in history where a violent overreach is a tyrant's final act before they're overthrown. Raskin tells us we should be terrified. 5 million of us, only 5 million of us in Washington, D.C. Oh, we'll be so helpless. Meanwhile, Trump had no issue sending a small mob to try to directly overthrow the government. Our movement to defend democracy and human rights is exponentially larger and more powerful, and the Democratic Party leadership refuses to win. They don't want us to understand that we have power. They would rather that we feel weak and completely reliant on them and have to channel all of our energies and our votes and our money towards them, even as they deport record numbers of immigrants and fund a genocide of civilians in Gaza abroad. So they just offer token opposition. They would prefer that we lose on a variety of issues, again, so that they can have talking points for the next election to try to sway conservative Trump voters to vote Democrat. We've seen that failing strategy before, and before, it made them look lame and weak. But now it's completely misguided because who's to say there will be another election, let alone a fair one, if Trump continues to only face token for the record opposition? Call Trump reactionary and racist and stupid all you want, but there's something that progressives and the left have to give him credit for. He actually tries to accomplish what he says he stands for. Now, I'm recording this in early February, and it may be that by the time you see this, that the Democrats are doing more. But I will assure you that it will be as limited as possible and only be done because they feel pressure from below, from the progressive base of their party who are fed up by their passivity. It will be them trying to jump in front of the movement to assert that they're the leadership of the movement so that it does not get out of their control. I've been comparing Raskin and the Democratic Party leadership to the failed opposition to Hitler in Germany in the 1930s. They too assumed that the fascists were all powerful. They didn't even try to mount a real fight. They resorted to maneuvers instead of setting in motion a powerful and angry mass movement. The Democrats are not building any opposition to Trump's mass deportations. In fact, scores of Democrats joined with the Republicans in passing an extreme immigrant bashing bill, the Lake and Raleigh Act. Immigrant bashing is the center of Donald Trump's fascist program. It's the equivalent of the opposition parties in Germany doing nothing to defend the Jews against anti-Semitism, even though the blaming everything on Jews was central to Hitler's program and demagogy. The General German Trade Union Federation, in German they were called the Allgemeine Deutsche Gewerkschaftsbund, or ADGB, was the country's largest trade union organization and the trade union arm of the Socialist Party, and they had over 3.5 million members. For years, the Federation's leadership downplayed the danger of the fascists and did not mobilize the mass power of their members, even as the fascists openly attacked them. After Hitler became chancellor in January 1933, the ADGB tried to pander to the Nazis. They were worried that protesting him strongly would lead him to ban them. When the Nazis outlawed all other organizations besides themselves from holding events to observe International Workers' Day, May 1st, and wanted to turn it into a Nazi National Labor Day, the ADGB approached the Nazis hat in hand and asked to be invited to the Nazis' rallies to promote the Nazis' message. They thought that this maneuver would protect them because how could Hitler ban a group that did not oppose him? They thought this maneuver would protect them because how could Hitler legally ban a group that said it supported him? It didn't help them, and the Nazis went forward with their National Labor Day. Here's a picture of Hitler in 1933 at that rally. And the day after, the Nazis sent the SS to raid all of the ADGB offices, arrested their leaders, and sent them to the concentration camps. Hitler succeeded not because he had the law on his side, but because he was willing to act while his opponents were not willing to act. The ADGB had hoped that the Constitution would protect them, but Hitler invoked a part of the German Constitution, that gave him legal cover for his actions, just as Trump today uses the law to justify whatever he wants, and with a Supreme Court that he can count on. The Constitution did not save democracy in Germany, and in fact, it became the mechanism that Hitler used to destroy it. Leon Trotsky, the famous communist who co-led the Russian Revolution with Lenin, who was later expelled from the party by Stalin after Stalin bureaucratized the party, wrote to the German workers in February 1933. He said, "The leaders of the social democracy, the socialists, and the trade unions wash their hands and relegate themselves to the sidelines while waiting. If the workers themselves, grouped together by industries, break the bonds of discipline and begin the struggle, the leaders obviously will intervene as they did in 1918 in the role of pacifiers and mediators, and will force themselves onto the workers' backs to reestablish the positions they have lost. The leaders conceal from the eyes of the masses their refusal to fight and their dread of the struggle by means of hollow phrases about non-aggression pacts. Social democratic workers, your leaders do not want to fight. Today, we need to heed the lesson that the German workers dearly bought. Today, the Democrats do not want to fight." Now, there's a reason the Democrats act this way, which I'll touch on later in the video. But this statement from BAMN, released a couple of weeks after the election, An American Catastrophe, Fascism Comes to America, does go into this in depth. I'll link to it in the description. You can also find it on the BAMN website. But it explains to how we got to where we got, where a fascist president has come into power, the failure of the Democratic Party, and what the American people must do to defeat fascism. But before I get to that, let's talk about the resistance, which has begun. It is being heavily underreported by both the conservative and liberal news media, both of whom want to promote fear-mongering and emphasize Trump's strength when that's not the whole picture. And I'm not going to start here with the immigrant rights marches, because the most important thing that has happened in the world recently is that the people of Gaza won. After 14 months of a brutal military campaign financed by the richest military in the world, the United States, the people of Gaza, a small, poor population, were able to force the Israeli government to agree to a ceasefire. Hamas, which Netanyahu had the official war aim of eradicating, Netanyahu had to come to an agreement with them. The Palestinians won the release of thousands of hostages who had been kept for years by Israeli authorities. Now, the media has been focused on the actions of this or that prominent politician, but all of the negotiations were conditioned by the fact that the people of Gaza were resisting, as well as by the international growing movement for Palestinian self-determination. U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken had to admit around the time that the ceasefire was reached that Hamas had replaced almost all of the fighters they had lost in Gaza with new recruits. Thousands of young people, many of whom probably did not agree with the ideology of Hamas, but opposed occupation, genocide, and slaughter, were replenishing Hamas. Meanwhile, the mass of the population was assisting them, finding ways to procure armaments, also organizing to make sure that the population was fed and got medical treatment under extreme conditions. There were grassroots efforts on the ground among Gazans so that everyone could get basic necessities. Now, the struggle, of course, is not over. The Palestinians still need self-determination. But this was a victory. And it has shown the world that the poor and oppressed can win. Here is the statement on the BAMN website that goes over all this in more detail, and I'll link to it in the description. And there are struggles rising around the world, including in the United States, and expectations rising thanks to the heroism of the people of Gaza. And the international movement for equality have the people of Gaza to thank. The victory of the Palestinians against a brutal campaign of ethnic cleansing in Gaza is inspiring movements here in the United States against the ethnic cleansing of America. And here I'm speaking of the immigrant rights marches. Immigrant bashing is the center of Trump's fascist program, just as anti-Semitism was for Hitler and the Nazis. Trump is essentially telling racist white people to fear the growing numbers of non-white people in the United States. The growth in the non-white population, most explained by the growth of the Latino community, Trump points to that and tells white people they are outnumbering you. They threaten your privilege. Racism against immigrants has been the rallying call of his campaign. It's the cutting edge of his attack on all non-white people and all of the groups, including LGBT people, women, Muslims, that he wants to attack. His dehumanizing rhetoric mirrors racist rhetoric by Hitler against the Jews. This means that his campaign of mass deportations is the fascist takeover, the coming of fascism in America. His placement of certain people in certain positions, while important, it does not fascism make. Fascism has as its central goal defeating the mass movements and defeating and breaking the backs of the communities that would overthrow it. Fascism taking power is ultimately something to be decided in the streets, and it requires making the immigrant communities retreat into the shadows. Trump's argument to his base that he needs to concentrate power in his own hands, his argument for authoritarianism, is that he needs it to carry out his ethnic cleansing and mass deportations. So immigrants who are fighting deportations are fighting to defend democracy for all Americans and fighting for an America that is what the vast majority of Americans want this nation to be. Here in the United States, Trump and his border czar, Tom Homan, they have been making a show of fulfilling Trump's promise of mass deporting over 10 million immigrants. And there have been immigrant rights marches around the country. And BAMN had predicted that the resistance would begin with the immigrant communities against these deportations. Around the country, people are figuring out how to resist ICE if they are to show up. And this model of resistance comes from actually before Trump's inauguration, from the community of Bakersfield, California, where Border Patrol agents under Biden showed up way far from the border and racially profiled Latino people and arrested them. People who knew these workers, who ate side by side with them, who had papers, immediately started to call people and put it out in social media and tell people, do not approach this place. You are in danger. And hundreds rallied the next day against these raids. Also, there was opposition by the agricultural industry, who lost a lot of workers who did not leave their homes to protect themselves from ICE during a crucial part of the season, because immigrants are a vital part of the economy in this country. And there are sections of the rich who don't agree with these immigration rates. And it's a factor in the fact that our movement can win. This provided a positive model of what to do if ICE shows up in your community. And since Trump's inauguration and his announcements of mass deportations and some actions by ICE, protests have been spreading and growing across the country. And I'm going to show some on the screen from Phoenix and Los Angeles. And in Los Angeles and other parts of the country, high school students are walking out. Monday, February 3rd, we in BAMN in Oakland, California, organized a protest, very successful, marching through that community. We're also organizing high school walkouts, and we've been working to popularize and organize mass community and worker self-defense guards to stop ICE. We take inspiration from the heroes of the Underground Railroad in the times of slavery and the heroes who sheltered Jews under the Nazis. We defend our friends and neighbors and classmates against the modern slave catchers and modern Gestapo. And we act on a rational definition of citizenship, that to be an American is to live here and work here and learn here, and to contribute to the development of this nation's economy and society, and to be committed to the American project of making real certain principles of liberty and equality on this national territory. The immigrant communities, who are millions strong, have tremendous power. Improving the lives of all workers with and without papers requires a militant labor movement, strikes, and other mass actions. That requires working class unity of all workers across race and national borders and national origin. We live in an increasingly interconnected global economy. So building this mass labor movement requires not ignoring racism, but fighting racism. The immigrant rights movement has had the largest demonstrations in U.S. history. Here's a picture from Los Angeles in 2006. I was there, and I remember it being a weekday, and everything was shut down. It's this movement of the largely Latino, but the whole immigrant community, united with the Black community fighting racism and police brutality and segregation, that has the power to win equality for all of us and to defeat Donald Trump and the Elon Musks of the world. And us Americans who were born here have a lot to learn from people coming from other countries, specifically the Latin American countries. Many of them have personally experienced or had people in their families who have experienced revolutions that have overthrown tyrants. And for many of them, they made huge sacrifices or endured harrowing ordeals to get here in the first place. These are the reasons why, as Trump starts his second term, that the main sources of optimism and fighting spirit are the immigrant communities. And it's also why Trump and his fascist movement are so determined to target these communities. They have to break the back of the immigrant communities for fascism to succeed. There probably will be more resistance that happens between when I record this and publish this video. Meanwhile, Donald Trump, like the businessman that he is, full of bombast and arrogance, used to having people do what he says, and too stupid and disconnected and unaware of what it actually takes to get certain things done. He's coming up against real obstacles in his fascist agenda. And I have a thumbnail on the screen of a video on the BAMN YouTube channel that I would recommend that's going to say these things much better than I can. One thing is that ICE so far is only reporting arrest numbers, not deportation numbers. At least at present, there is limited detention capacity for them to detain the people they want. And people are not signing away their own deportations. At least under current law, there are a number of ways one can apply for relief from deportation. And so as this article shows, ICE is now having to release many of the people that they very publicly arrested. There are real obstacles in the law and logistically to deporting 11 million people. But the biggest obstacle of all is the fact that taking 11 million people out of this country means civil war in the streets of America. To conduct deportations, the most effective way to do that was shown by former President Obama, who deported more immigrants than any other U.S. president, Trump included. The way his administration did it was more sophisticated and did it without getting masses of people in the streets. Donald Trump, in his first term, despite some public and particularly cruel acts, including caging children, had fewer deportations than Obama, and Clinton and Bush. Trump's arrogance is confronting reality. And that video I showed you earlier goes into other areas in which he's coming up against obstacles. It was widely publicized that he pardoned the January 6th insurrectionists who tried to violently put him in power. However, that is being met with hostility from the law enforcement community, some of whose cops were killed on January 6th. The police have their own code, and they will not take lightly anyone who assaults a police officer. Here's an article about an Indiana man who was pardoned for January 6th, who was killed by a cop during a traffic stop. Trump's overhaul of the FBI has also been drawing opposition within the agency. These are not actions that one who wants to establish a consolidated fascist state wants to take. And most recently, and I think this was today, it's hard to keep track nowadays, Trump's brazen and idiotic statement about evicting all people of Gaza and the United States occupying it has prompted Saudi Arabia, who had been in negotiations with Israel to normalize relations with Israel, to cut off those talks and to say that they will have no ties with Israel unless there's a Palestinian state. The normalization talks between these two countries, which would have isolated the people of Palestine, were underway in 2023 when October 7th happened. And it was one of Hamas's aims to break up this talk. And Trump handed another victory to them. Donald Trump is now the number one factor leading toward more struggles for equality and freedom and revolution in the world. And the barrier to these movements growing has never been the objective power of our enemies. We have greater power, but the need to understand among masses of people on our side that we need to take matters into our own hands. Next, I'm going to talk about how the Donald Trump presidency is illegitimate. This is merely applying the same principle that led to the American Revolution. Again, people should read this flyer on the screen. It's really great. But this point is encapsulated in this box in the bottom right here. It says, "We must defend this. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all human beings are created equal, that they are endowed with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. We must defend this by any means necessary." Trump's movement exists to undermine and destroy these democratic principles. The American people themselves must rise up to defend democracy. These words, of course, are words that all American school children should recognize. They are from the American Declaration of Independence. We are taught this in school, and the majority of Americans believe in these principles. The United States, as defined by racism and slavery in its history, also has the American Revolutionary War and the Civil War, which were progressive revolutions in which regular people fought for freedom and progress and won. We are taught that all humans are created equal and have unalienable rights. Under this definition, the immigrants who are contributing to this country are human beings who deserve full rights. Similarly, women, Black people, Asian people, gay people, trans people are human beings and have unalienable rights. Any government that tries to violate human rights is illegitimate, and we defy it. That's our starting point, and it's an American tradition. Those who say that Trump may violate these rights are violating one of the nation's founding principles. Given that Trump has openly said he wants to violate human rights, end democratic traditions, and violate the rule of law, he is an illegitimate president. The word democracy, when you look at its origin in Latin, means that the people rule. Democracy is not a formal process. There's no such thing as a, quote, democratic vote to end democracy. That's an absurdity. Any government that tries to violate the human rights of millions of its own people is not legitimate. This was the attitude of the abolitionist movement to end slavery toward the American government, which legalized slavery and with the fugitive slave law empowered racist kidnappers to accuse any Black person in the North to be a fugitive slave. The judges who made the decision whether to send a person back to servitude were paid more money if they found the person to be a slave than if they found them to be free. This racist law was perfectly constitutional, and many Northern communities had elected politicians who had voted for it. But the abolitionists said, no, we will not recognize any law, no matter what supposedly democratic process passed it, and we will defy that law. You're not going to take away people who went north to find freedom. Integrated crowds of Black and white people, in some places, broke into courthouses to free Black people who were being accused of being a fugitive slave. The naturalist and philosopher Henry David Thoreau wrote a famous essay titled On Civil Disobedience in 1849 against his own government, And he wrote, "How does it become a man to behave toward the American government today? I answer that he cannot without disgrace be associated with it. I cannot for an instant recognize that political organization as my government, which is the slave's government also." The only way any consistent defender of democracy should act if the government tries to destroy democratic rights is to undermine that government. But the Democratic Party politicians, despite the name of their party, are, since Trump's election, going out of their way to say that Trump is legitimate and to quiet protests against him. Here's an article from the New York Times from November 16, where the party leadership's anti-Trump battle plan focuses on legal fights rather than marching in the streets. The Democrats are telling people to go home, call your senator, and that we should use the courts. Of course, the U.S. Supreme Court is dominated by Trump, and 9 lifetime appointed judges are the opposite of any idea of democracy. Some Democratic Party politicians are rightly standing up and calling out Elon Musk for trying to take over part of the government. But a notable part of these politicians' rhetoric is pointing out that Elon Musk was unelected. They're still saying, as of now, that Donald Trump, his authority cannot be challenged because he was supposedly elected in a supposedly democratic election. The Democratic Party leaders are paralyzed by the fact that Donald Trump won the Electoral College and had more votes in the popular vote than Kamala Harris. They unquestioningly hold up that formal process as what democracy consists of, even when the new incoming government is a fascist government, and fascism by definition exists to undermine democracy. The 2024 election that put Trump in the presidency is illegitimate for other reasons, and the flyer goes into this. First, more than 11 million people who are members of this society and contribute to this society had no right to vote in this election. Of course, the Electoral College heavily favors conservative rural voters. But fundamentally, everyone knows or must admit that the US political system does not express the democratic aspirations of the American people. US elections are, even more than in the past, vast rituals of a sort of pretend democracy, in which the mass of us are allowed to go through a spectacle of voting that serves as a movie-like background accompaniment to the actual very tedious process by which a handful of very rich and powerful people determine who is going to rule America and the world as presidents of the United States. This is not some conspiracy theory. It's simply a candid summation of generally known facts about the American political system. The candidates of the 2 main political parties are basically funded and owned by the very rich people who fund their campaigns. Here's an article showing that 83 billionaires, and 2 of them were, I have not heard this term before, centibillionaires supported Kamala Harris, and 52 billionaires, and including 1 centibillionaire, supported Trump. The rich also own the news media and control the major sources of information and opinion, even defining the parameters of political discourse in our nation. I'll go into this later, but one of the 2 parties that the wealthy fund, the Democratic Party, was too weak, hypocritical, and corrupted by its billionaire backers and owners to make any serious opposition to fascism. In the end, the placement of Trump in the presidency was the decision of some of these already economically powerful tyrants, first and foremost Elon Musk, who control the American political process, to attempt to match their economic power with tyrannical power over the American state that has determined the government's moves toward fascist government, not some mysterious, spontaneous fit of authoritarian insanity rising up in the hearts and minds of the mass of American people. Finally, you would never hear this coming from the Democratic Party or the liberal news media, but Trump is a plurality president. Over 2.5 million people did not vote for either Harris or Trump, and all of them voted for candidates who were to the left of Trump, or as not far right as Trump, on his core political positions. And of course, millions more were too disgusted to vote or denied the right to vote. So Trump's presidency is not legitimate, and our movement against him and his fascist movement is far more powerful. As Frederick Douglass said, find out just what people submit to, and you have found out the exact amount of injustice and wrong which will be imposed upon them. So Trump, you want to deport 11 million immigrants? What if we physically stop you? And while we're at it, what if we were to use those same methods of mass action to challenge the gross concentration of wealth in the Elon Musks of the world? And this is why my group proudly says by any means necessary, which is a phrase that originated with Malcolm X. This is something that we wrote early in our history in defending affirmative action, which are desegregation programs for higher education and employment. He stated the plain truth that the American political system is dominated by the rich. He called democracy nothing but disguised hypocrisy and said that we need action on all fronts by whatever means necessary. This means that in the Jim Crow South, where legal segregation and degradation of Black people was the law, we would have had the same attitude. We would not bow down before racist segregation and inequality, whether it is supposedly popular or not. A ballot initiative in Mississippi in 1963 would have endorsed Jim Crow. That would not have made us any less determined to raise the Jim Crow structure to the ground. I'll say more about what we need to do in a later section in the video. Next, the Democratic Party paved the way for Trump. We need BAMN and clear leadership of fighting by any means necessary because the old methods have failed. They're what brought us to this point. The majority of Americans oppose fascism, but have been held back by the misleadership of the Democratic Party, tops, and the liberal establishment organizations, the leaders of the unions and the civil rights and immigrant rights organizations. So the front page of that flyer I keep coming back to, it's such a comprehensive statement, has a characterization of the American election and of the two parties that the American voters had to choose between, well, the two main parties. We call the American election of 2024 itself a capitalist tyranny, led by Donald Trump, aided and abetted by a servile, bankrupt two-party system. In this election, the Republican Party is simply becoming a fascist party under Trump, and the Democratic Party is too weak, hypocritical, and corrupted by its own billionaire donors/owners, incapable of defending and advancing democracy and equal rights in America, and committed to arming the ethnic cleansing and genocide carried out by the Netanyahu government of Israel against the heroic Palestinian people. And we call for an end to normalizing Trump and legitimizing fascism. In the 2024 election, the American people found themselves faced with two unacceptable electoral options. Two parties, each committed in different ways to policies abhorrent to the democratic, humane, and progressive principles that most Americans have believed since they were children. The Republicans and Democrats presented, in effect, two different aspects of the American government of a movement toward fascism. For the Republicans, this is the relatively simple Trump-declared plan to move toward the creation of an authoritarian, fascistic government under the gang boss-style, mobocratic leadership of Trump himself. For both parties, this fascist trend reveals itself in the fact that it is increasingly a central characteristic of American foreign policy to support authoritarian governments and to fear and oppose democratic movements abroad. The most extreme form of this was the Biden administration's absolute commitment to fund the slaughter of civilians in Gaza who are seeking self-determination, an act condemned by most of the world and declared war crimes by the world's highest judicial body, the UN International Court of Justice, the ICJ. The flyer goes into this in more detail, but for the Democrats, the fact that their billionaire funders, their owners, oppose the setting in motion of powerful movements for equality here and abroad meant that the Democrats normalized Trump and normalized fascism during the presidential campaign. They infantilized the American people with happy talk and talked about staying calm.
And end the drama. Keep Kamala and carry on.
Instead of speaking the plain truth about the attack on democracy and mobilizing an outraged movement to defend democracy. Their second problem was Gaza. The party's progressive base couldn't swallow support for Israel's crimes against humanity. Harris, during her campaign, enthusiastically supported militarism and boasted,
"I will ensure America always has the strongest, most lethal fighting force in the world,"
as if utterly determined to drive out the Democratic Party's most humane and compassionate supporters out of the election altogether. In reality, The capitalists who funded the Democratic Party's presidential campaign behaved as if they were more afraid of building a movement strong, powerful, courageous, and bold enough to defeat Trump than they were of a Trump victory. And they are still behaving that way. They have told people not to protest and to stop marching in the streets. Raskin is telling us that terrible things will happen if we march in Washington. Instead of calling people into the streets to defend democracy, they are talking about an electoral strategy for the next election. But if we don't defend democracy, there might not be a new election or a fair one. We're being told a combination of everything's fine, stay calm on the one hand, and fear-mongering on the other hand, both of which have the same aim of keeping us at home. We're told to rely on court suits and legal arguments instead of our own power in the streets, as if the law will protect us, and as if the Trump Supreme Court will uphold democracy. The liberal news media is trying to ignore and underreport the level to which the resistance is in the streets and is instead exaggerating Trump's apparent power and talking about Trump, Trump, Trump and what he's doing instead of what we're doing. Remember, they know that they can call 5 million people to Washington, D.C. In reality, Trump can only accomplish what he accomplishes with the Democratic Party's complicity, and the party leadership is obliging him. The Democrats' commitment to not stand up against Trump resulted in many Democrats, scores of them in fact, even voting for the immigrant bashing and racist Lake and Riley Act that just passed. It allows indefinite detention of immigrants who are merely suspected of shoplifting and other crimes without due process. It prepares the way for building mass concentration camps and violates the civil liberties of immigrants and sets the precedent for violating civil liberties of everyone. Even though the Democrats are a minority in Congress, they could have filibustered, done other things. But defeating it in reality, which was possible, would have required setting in motion a movement that they did not want to set in motion. Finally, to the extent that the Democrats are showing any opposition to what Trump is doing, it is largely for the record. As I said, a future election talking point to be able to point at something horrible the Republicans did in another failed attempt to try to get Trump voters to vote Democrat. And they're avoiding issues such as immigrant rights that, if they were to fight seriously around them, could galvanize a powerful, broad, popular mass movement that could defeat Trump and his whole fascist agenda. This problem I'm talking about is not limited to the right wing of the party either. Bernie Sanders is a hero among many progressives for his lifelong principled stand for universal health care. However, despite his formal status as an independent, has always been a loyal Democrat with an electoralist approach and never one to call for mass struggle. His language saying that the party has abandoned working people uses language that fed racist right-wing demagogy against so-called identity politics. Identity politics is a misleading euphemism, mainly coming from the right, for expressing any consciousness or concern for racial, sexual, or other forms of oppression in America that cannot be understood in terms of economic inequality alone. Sanders, therefore, gave aid and comfort, perhaps a blunder, to the argument that is common in the Democratic Party, that all opposition to inequality should be limited to economic issues alone. But this ignores that exploiting the poor requires racism, sexism, and other forms of bigotry, other divisions, to divide and rule over the poor, which is the fundamental basis of Trump's politics. Fighting for human equality is not counterposed to fighting the billionaires. It is key to fighting the billionaires. Improving the standard of living of all workers requires mass worker action, so strikes and other assertions of our collective power. And the immigrant community, the vast majority of whom are workers, have demonstrated precisely that. I was in Los Angeles during the marches in 2006, and the complete shutdown of Los Angeles was what a general strike would have done. But people like Sanders don't see or choose not to see the immigrants, and in their own left-wing way, commit the same mistake that the right wing of the party is making, of thinking in narrow electoral terms and how to bring back disaffected white people who voted for Trump. Many of whom will not vote for Democrats, who in fact only will be moved towards the political left more if they see a serious fight for equality on our side. See that we're serious, that we actually are fighting for what we say we believe in, which Trump has the advantage of over the Democrats. And of course, now the Democrats are avoiding using the word fascist to describe what Trump's doing after the election. They had been prepared to call him fascist before the election. They were prepared to use it when it was an electoral talking point. But when actual fascism is here, they're not willing to build a fight to seriously oppose it. They specifically try to avoid using the term fascism in order to avoid arousing the kind of indignation and anger and power that's needed to defeat it when it's actually needed most. If democracy were to die in America, it would not be by any act of Trump. It would be because we stay home, and specifically because of so-called leaders like Raskin and other Democratic Party politicians who are more afraid of 5 million people demanding equality in DC and millions more around the country than they are of what would happen if Trump implements fascism. They have proven themselves unfit for the task of history. Next, fascism, what it is and how to defeat it. We have to describe what it is and where it draws its strength in order to defeat it. All right, back to the flyer, the comprehensive flyer. We use the word fascism, and we don't use that word lightly. In fact, we understand that many people and organizations overuse it historically and not used it responsibly. It's a term we avoided using during Trump's first term, during his first presidency. That changed with the January 6th events. Fascism is not just a very right-wing government. It's not just a racist government. It's not just any dictatorship either. It's a specific phenomenon in history that arises in certain extreme circumstances, historical circumstances, that develops in countries by and large that are democracies. In Germany, a section of the capitalist class, the capitalists are the people who don't work and who own the means of production, own the capital, including finance capital, funded Hitler's Nazi Party and his rise to power. In normal times, the capitalists treat democracy as a safety valve. It's just a more stable situation for them to be able to tell workers and other people that if you face injustice, if something wrong happens, you can vote for new leadership. You can appeal to the law, which is supposedly neutral, and bring a lawsuit. There's no need for revolution because you have democracy. Vladimir Lenin, the leader of the Russian Revolution, has a quote where he says that a democratic republic is the best possible political shell for capitalism. I already went over earlier how democracy in the United States isn't really democracy. It's dominated by the very rich. And so he uses the word shell here to describe a democratic republic, a shell to disguise an actual situation where the rich rule. This suffices for normal times, especially since the capitalists, the rich, own the means of information and own the candidates with their wealth. However, we don't live in normal times. There is a deepening crisis in the global economic system. Everyone has a sense that our lives are not improving. Our standard of living is stagnating and worsening in many places around the world, in fact. The global heating crisis, the climate crisis, is also getting out of control. It's already creating extreme weather conditions around the world, having a disastrous impact on human beings. And it's these extreme weather conditions that are behind much of the rise in global migration, people having to flee their own countries as the effects of climate change affect basic conditions of life like food and destabilize governments. This United Nations study on the world economic situation and prospects in 2025 reports on low economic growth, persistent food inflation, and the crises of debt, inequality, and climate change, all of which require radical solutions that require incursions into private property and the operation of the free market. Because the system is not able to solve these problems, a wing of the capitalist class is increasingly coming to the conclusion that it's too dangerous to keep democracy and civil liberties and freedom of speech and unions and having civil rights organizations. They're concluding that the safety valves of democracy are eventually going to fail at holding back mass struggle that leads to revolution because it's not possible to grant reforms that solve these deepening problems that I've very briefly summarized. So a wing of the extremely rich capitalist class is deciding that in order to prevent that, it's time to destroy the movements and the organizations and the communities that would carry out revolution. All along, even the liberal wing of the capitalists who support the Democratic Party have wanted to preserve the option of fascism for their class. Biden's Department of Justice refused to prosecute Donald Trump for carrying out an insurrection on January 6th, which, had they succeeded, would have made a clearer case that he had no right to run for president under the Constitution's prohibition of people who lead insurrection taking public office. Any party that seriously defended democracy would stand on this clear article of the Constitution, which says that people who try to overthrow democracy have no respect for the Constitution and cannot be entrusted with enforcing it. Instead, they preserved the fascist option and Donald Trump. And now they have put him in office in order to destroy what Lenin called the shell of democracy. So they fund and utilize a reactionary mass movement. And in Italy and Germany, like now, there has been an appeal to a mythical past, a mythical ideal. For Mussolini in Italy, it was the Roman Empire. For Hitler, it was about creating a third great age for Germany, a third Reich. And for Trump, it is a golden age of America. And of course, fascism needs its scapegoats to blame its problems on a group. He has gone after trans people and women. He is going after all movements for progress, after science, whipping up hysteria, basically saying that democracy itself is the enemy and that the nation's problems need to be solved by an authoritarian great leader. And the centerpiece, the rallying cry of Trump's supporters, the center of his demagogy, is his racist attacks on immigrants, just as antisemitism was for Hitler. In Germany and Italy, they use the official state power in tandem with an extra-legal paramilitary force to destroy the movements. And for Trump, he has his extra-legal people, many of whom he pardoned from January 6th, to try to overthrow or use violence against anything he disagrees with. What's happening here is part of a worldwide trend. Around the world, in country after country, capitalists are funding and supporting the rise of far-right and fascist parties that are enjoying more success than at any time since World War II. Parties like Alternative for Germany, a far-right group that Elon Musk addressed recently. In the United States, a wing of the capitalists have a specific fear of losing the United States' #1 position as the world's largest economy to China. To compete with China, they feel like they need to impose tariffs, which will probably backfire, but also to squeeze more profit out of workers, lower wages, attack healthcare, and so on, so that they can compete against Chinese competition. Accordingly, Elon Musk is rabidly anti-union because unions are an obstacle to what he wants to carry out. Because workers don't want this, fascism needs to strengthen the state and take away democratic norms and attack the mass movements and end the mass movements if it can. Another factor in all this is that Trump and fascism will not fulfill his promises. Trump will not improve the lives of workers, not even white workers with racism and xenophobia. Many white workers don't want to take the jobs that many undocumented workers do. And the trade war that Trump is provoking against the US's historical allies is only going to worsen the lives of workers. The more his rabid base is disappointed, the more he needs to direct their discontentment towards scapegoats such as immigrants, or outward towards other countries through war. And trade wars are incipient real wars, and a trade war between the two largest economies, the US and China, if that were to become a real war, would be World War III. One thing that's different between what's happening in the US now and Italy and Germany is that in those countries, fascism was a response to near revolutions by workers that already had happened in the wake of World War I. The workers' leaders betraying them in those countries and the disenchantment and disillusionment from workers about those leaderships that followed was a factor in the rise of fascism in those countries. In the US, fascism has come to prevent a revolution in advance. The United States is becoming increasingly diverse, and it will be a majority-minority country, the way California has been for quite a while, in about 20 years. The young generation is far more progressive than its parents on a wide variety of issues. Only 72% of Gen Z identified as straight. 15% identify as bisexual, 5% as gay or lesbian, and 8% as something else. Young people are relying far more on social media than on traditional news outlets to get their information, and are much more pro-Palestine than the older generations. You can say that fascism in the US is a defensive rearguard action, one that comes from a sense of weakness on the part of the capitalists than of strength. Some people who voted for Trump did so out of a real sense of discontentment about a worsening of the conditions of their lives, but they're being misled by racism and sexism and other forms of bigotry to accept authoritarianism. And it's a dead end, obviously, for them. However, our movement cannot win them over by placating their bigotry. We need to speak the plain truth and show that there is an alternative power to the Trumps and the Elon Musks in this world. There's the resistance, there is the mass movement, and there are the immigrant communities who are dynamic and left-wing, who they can unite with to wrest power from the billionaires. The fact that the country that's supposed to represent democracy in the world has taken the road of fascism is a sign of a deep crisis in the world capitalist system. Neither party, owned by the rich, expresses the aspirations for freedom and a better life held by the vast majority of American people. An indescribably wealthy, tiny minority of billionaires rule. And that's why the wealthy funders of the Democratic Party are so fearful of calling into being, setting into motion, what have you, any movements that will break out of their control. People learn quickly once they are in the streets and in struggle. People learn quickly the power that they have and who their real friends are and their real enemies. The complete inability of the capitalist class to solve today's problems, whether that's through democracy or fascism, that is the stuff of revolution. All right, what we must do. First, part one is to stop the deportations. And this is going to sound kind of silly. The fact that I have to say it sounds silly, but to defeat fascism, we need to defeat fascism. We need to stop it from accomplishing its aims by any means necessary. And that's going to require independent collective action. Our biggest and most important opportunity to do that is stopping Trump's mass deportations through community mass self-defense, to organize resistance and community worker defense guards to prevent ICE from entering and kidnapping people in our communities. So this means call a rally or march or walkout in your area. The BAMN website is a resource. We also have a page on stopping ICE terror with concrete suggestions of what to do in advance of ICE showing up in your community and what to do if they do. If ICE is spotted, do what is necessary. Spread specific information out on social media and other channels to get people out. People who have papers who are relatively safe should come out in numbers. Here's a picture of something that BAMN did in Detroit, Michigan. Donald Trump did mass arrests of Iraqi Chaldean Christians. ICE tried to drive out a bus that contained dozens of these detainees, and we got the community to block the bus. In Nashville, Tennessee, neighbors came out and defended their neighbor and his son, who ICE came for to arrest by forming a human chain, and were able to force ICE to leave so that they could leave for safety. What we need to do in our specific locations is going to look different everywhere, but the bottom line is acting collectively and doing what is needed to protect people. Students and teachers in schools, it's time to form a plan of what you will collectively do if ICE shows up. And not just schools. Young people need to take the lead in their communities, coming up with plans how to collectively act if ICE were to go into our neighborhoods. We need to declare sanctuaries, sanctuary churches, buildings, union halls, where immigrants know to go and the community will defend them if they are facing arrest and deportation. students at colleges and other places can take the lead in this movement, just as students during the anti-Vietnam War movement welcomed draft resistors and defended draft resistors from arrest by the government. And during the immigrant rights movement of 2006, immigrants facing deportations took sanctuary in churches with the community occupying and surrounding them. If you belong to an organization, a union, a church, a social group, have them take action. We can win, and we can defend American democracy. Our side is so much stronger. At the start of Trump's first term, millions of people participated in the women's marches around the country. And within days, when Trump tried to implement the Muslim ban, thousands of people occupied airports and made that impossible. The movement paralyzed Trump and limited what he thought he could get away with afterward. He was only able to get away with things to the extent our leaders misled us into going home. I remember a whole period of time in which Democratic Party politicians and unions would not even utter the name Trump. The George Floyd movement of 2020 also paralyzed Trump. He wanted to send troops and police to quell the protests, but that failed. All of his efforts only succeeded in expanding the movement. Our side has far more power. We have far greater numbers, and we know we stand on the conviction that we stand on the truth and for the interests of the vast majority of Americans. Meanwhile, the fascists cannot mobilize like we do. They don't have the traditions of collective struggle. They're scattered and atomized, and ultimately, their problem is that their movement is rooted in despair. We can isolate the fascists. We can stop the deportation of 11 million people. We stand on the truth, on the plain reality of the equality of the human beings who are next to us. Here's an extended passage from our Declaration on Immigrant Rights titled Yearning to Breathe Free. To be an American is to live and learn and work here, to contribute to the development of the nation's economy and society, to contribute the best of one's own linguistic and cultural legacy to its diverse culture, and to be committed to the American project of making real certain principles of liberty and equality on this national territory. By this rational standard, the great majority of the millions of supposed illegal aliens are already contributing members of our national community and should have that reality recognized in the law by being afforded the right to become citizens now. Next is part 2 of what we need to do now, which is to learn from Dr. Martin Luther King and other great leaders in history, and to join BAMN. History, at its key decisive turning points, turns on the basis of leadership and who is leading. We have one extreme and dangerous alternative, that of Trump and fascism, and the other alternative is building the new movement for equality. Had there been an opposition to Hitler in Germany in the 1930s that wasn't simply preaching passivity and faith in the law and thinking strictly in terms of electoralism, then the history of Germany and of the world would have gone a completely different direction. This is where I pose a challenge to viewers watching today, which is to join BAMN and to support BAMN. The kind of movement that's needed, the kind that is courageous and bold and, as Frederick Douglass said, all-encompassing, only happens if there is an organization that is committed to leading it. The current marches for immigrant rights are in danger of being misled and shut down. The immigrant rights marches in 2006 were the largest demonstrations in U.S. history, but principals, parents, priests, and politicians told the young people who were leading that movement and walking out of their schools to stop walking out. They were told that it was supposedly harmful to walk out. Well-funded organizations called protests where the official slogan was, "Today we march and tomorrow we vote." These changed the focus of the movement over time away from expressing our collective power towards get out the vote rallies. Let's make sure the Democrats have power. This sidelined the young people who were leading the walkouts who could not vote, and the undocumented immigrants who could not vote either and whom the movements were supposed to be fighting for. The movement had the power, if it had kept marching, to win full citizenship rights for all immigrants in 2006. Instead, the movement directed its energies towards Obama, and the most popular chant in the 2006 demonstrations, "Si se puede," became "Yes, we can." But where has that led us? Obama deported more immigrants than any other US president. And shutting down our movement and following the Democratic Party's leadership has led to fascism. This co-opting of our movement would be led by people who present themselves as progressive, but who, for whatever reason, like Raskin, fear masses of people in the streets, and especially fear lots of young people in the streets. Instead of wielding our collective power, we're told that we need to call our senators, or ultimately that the power we need is someone above us, some higher authority. And therefore we must prioritize above everything else respectability, quote unquote, in order not to offend those so-called friends. Dr. Martin Luther King, the most important leader of the civil rights movement of the 50s and 60s, is idealized today as someone who merely preached love and understanding. But while he was alive, he was vilified not only by the racist segregationists, but also by liberals and more conservative Black leaders. And one thing he was sharply criticized for was calling on young people to join the movement. In 1963, he helped lead the successful campaign in Birmingham, Alabama, to end legal segregation. Young people, primarily high school and middle school students, won the struggle of Birmingham. The established Black leaders of Birmingham had avoided him. Only one religious leader, Reverend Fred Shuttlesworth, pictured here on the left in Birmingham, Alabama, worked with him. There is a liberal mythology about Birmingham that is taught in accounts of the civil rights movement, that it was the scenes of the victimization of children that overturned segregation because it dramatized the plight and suffering of Black people in the South. Now, not to deny that it was completely stirring and outrageous for the country to see those scenes of brutality against children, but it was the young people's defiance in the face of that violence that won the struggle of Birmingham. After the initial shock of those water cannons, young people kept coming out and turned it into a party.
By Saturday, some kids were coming downtown in their bathing suits.
It was fun. The children will be out there shaking. Some went up to the water, put the water on me. You bad?
This young guy was standing in there.
They were calling them names, talk about their mama and all kinds of stuff.
The prospect of going to jail as a Black person in Birmingham, Alabama, which MLK called the most segregated city in the US, was typically a degrading and terrifying experience. Black people were lynched in jail. But it became a tactic of the movement to overwhelm the jail system of Birmingham, Alabama, that caused many young people to enthusiastically go into those jails. Looking at these scenes, one gets the sense that the young people were having fun.
The children were saying, I want to go to jail. I want to go to jail.
She got rollers, hair curlers, everything you can think of in her handbag.
Why does she have those?
For jail. You gotta look good in jail.
I want equal rights. I want equal rights. Just like everybody else. Just like everybody else. I want my freedom just like everybody else.
And within days, the young people were continuing to march. They were marching every day. And the police could not stop them from reaching the segregated downtown area.
By Tuesday, May 7th, the city of Birmingham faced a state of collapse. 3,000 students were stampeding through downtown in a victory lap. The police had been made helpless.
Kids was everywhere, you know what I mean? All down through town.
We couldn't stop it. We couldn't contain it.
The heart of Birmingham was shut down with nary a white business owner or shopper in sight. As Frederick Douglass said, the limits of tyrants are prescribed by the endurance of those whom they oppress. The young people of Birmingham, Alabama, had decided to stop enduring oppression
By the seventh day of demonstrations, it became obvious there was no end of children in sight.
I was sitting there in the jail and I said, no way to hold a lid on this. The fear's gone.
Within a few days, the movement won a formal agreement with the city government and the downtown businesses to desegregate. The movement won not because they victimized themselves to appeal to white sympathy, but because young Black people asserted their power. This victory was a sensation across the country, and young people in city after city across the segregated South did copycat movements and marched and also did strikes. They refused to go to school and they kept marching day after day for desegregation. Marches flooded the South the rest of that spring and the summer, leading directly to the historic March on Washington, where Martin Luther King gave his great I Have a Dream speech. The liberal mythology and rewriting of history has been perpetuated to convince us and make us continue to feel like we don't have power when we actually do have power. I opened with this story because being in BAM, I think we have a unique perspective on the key role that young people taking their own action for themselves has in a movement for freedom that I have not seen another group in my nearly 30 years act on in nearly the same way. And we work regularly with high school and even middle school students to organize actions. Now, I hope you'll be patient with me as I share part of what we call the BAM Pledge to become a leader of the new independent, integrated, youth-led civil rights, immigrant rights movement that we regularly read with young people when they join BAM. When I read it, I want you to think of the two very contrasting styles of leadership that I've visited upon in this video. That of Congressman Jamie Raskin of the Democratic Party, who says that having 5 million people in Washington, D.C. protesting Donald Trump would be disastrous. And on the other hand, Dr. Martin Luther King, who did not think a March on Washington would be disastrous. And at the time he called the March on Washington, the Ku Klux Klan was actually targeting and killing leaders of the movement. Everyone thought that thousands of Black people marching in Washington, D.C. would lead to violence. The march fell on a Wednesday, on a weekday, and because of that fear, none of the politicians or government workers were to be seen. It was just a huge and successful outpouring of the national civil rights movement. And the march inspired the spread of the civil rights movement across the country. Congressman Raskin and Dr. Martin Luther King, two very different policies on marching on Washington and two very different styles of leadership. Here's the quote from the BAM Pledge. To win, our new movements need a core of determined, optimistic young leaders who are prepared to lead in action and to learn from both their own experiences in struggle and from America's two greatest and most successful leaders of militant mass movements of the oppressed, Frederick Douglass and Dr. Martin Luther King. I pledge to accept the challenge of becoming my generation's voice of freedom. I know this requires always speaking for and to the oppressed, telling the truth about racism and inequality, and expressing both the anger and the aspirations of our communities. I reject the popular, wrong, and dominant ideology of most of those who claim to support progressive reforms, that the only people who have the power to make and change history are the rich and powerful. Accepting this false assumption places the oppressed in the dead-end position of having no alternatives other than making moral appeals to the rich and powerful, or trying to find clever arguments to convince them that granting our demands will make it easier for them to exploit us. Those who are in power and currently decide the social, economic, and political policies of our nation are completely aware that their determination to prioritize profits over people causes the vast majority of the world's people to live in squalor and in despair. Changing the actions, attitudes of the rich and powerful and their political representatives requires asserting through mass action the superior power and will of the masses. This is the only road to victory. Congressman Raskin sees the only people having power being Trump, the Republicans, and the Supreme Court, and the rabble, the Proud Boys and their ilk, who work with them. But they're not the only ones with power, and they are far less powerful than our side when we are mobilized. So unless we build BAMN and a new leadership that mobilizes our superior power, this new movement will be co-opted. In some fashion, the young people who are walking out now and the immigrant communities will be told to rely upon some other authority or power than our own collective power, and that will lead the movement to lose. So what to do specifically? Well, if you are already calling on people to march or walk out for immigrant rights, then you're already acting on BAMN's method, and you should join BAMN. If you're not, you should still join BAMN and join our efforts to organize marches and walkouts in cities around the country. Our movement needs a core of optimistic young leaders, like that pledge said. And not just young leaders, but also people young at heart. I am 47 years old, but young at heart, who are part of a collective leadership where we support each other as we learn from the struggle, as we build it, and from the communities we're mobilizing and working with each other while studying history and so forth. And if you're someone who is like me when I was a teenager, someone who doesn't see yourself as a leader, someone who can make history, you're wrong. It doesn't take someone who can deliver fancy speeches who can make history. And this is another part of the BAMN pledge. Actions speak louder than words. We judge leaders by what they do and not their ability to make great speeches which they never deliver on. I pledge to be a great leader by always being proud of who I am and by just being myself. I am a role model for others when I am not ashamed to be myself. I cannot stand on the truth if I am trying to act like the people in power who oppress us and assign us to second-class status. If you've seen my coming out video, yes, being myself is core to why I'm in BAMN, and also, I think, helps me be an effective leader. And it even translates to my RPG channel. I think part of the appeal of my channel about RPGs is that I try to be myself. And I think that as a general proposition is equally true about being a leader of a mass movement, where we're asking other people to be themselves. So before the last section of this video, I want to tell you how you can get involved. I'm leaving BAMN's contact information in the video description. Here is our website, bam.com. We also have a YouTube channel. It's just National BAMN as one word. And we are also on Instagram, Join BAMN, and on TikTok, Join BAMN. Oh, I should follow myself. If you're on mobile, we have a link page that I will link to in the video description also that lets you easily access all of these things I'm showing you. We have a Facebook page. Look for BAMN page, one word. And yeah, you should form a BAMN chapter in your school or in your area. If you reach out to BAMN, drop my name. I like to know whether this video had an impact. And also, you can try to reach me through my Discord server, which also will be linked in the description. That is based around my channel, where we already have a community of progressive-minded people as a result of my past videos. The other thing you can do, of course, is to donate. And supporting my Patreon is one way you can de facto support us. Because, anyway, I give all of my disposable income, well, except for some RPGs and games, to the cause. Just 2 weeks ago, I gave $10,000 to the current organizing we're doing of high school walkouts and organizing mass resistance of immigrants in the shelters in New York and other places if ICE were to go into those shelters. And I calculated that donation after doing the math to see what was the maximum I could give. And that money was a result of this Patreon, really. I wouldn't have been able to give that donation otherwise. You will have a direct impact on the movement if you give. The money goes towards our travel, flyers, amplified sound. Recently at a protest, members of our group were in a crowd of about 1,000 people who were out enthusiastically wanting to support immigrant rights. And we found out that an immigrant rights activist in the community had been detained by ICE and was being detained 5 blocks away from the protest site. And we knew that people would have wanted to march there and try to make sure she was freed. But the leaders who have official ties with the city government establishment made sure people stayed. They wanted to keep the protest a symbolic letting off steam event instead of something that could have immediately won something and built the movement. That's just one of many examples I could give of how BAM being somewhere and supporting us can make a huge difference. BAM also has an affiliated nonprofit legal organization called United for Equality and Affirmative Action Legal Defense Fund. You can donate to us on PayPal by typing in UEAALDF, and it is a recipient that shows up. Your donation goes towards our legal work defending immigrants from deportation, defending the free speech rights of activists, and our current intervention in a federal court where we're defending the free speech rights of pro-Palestine students at UC Berkeley against a right-wing lawsuit. This lawsuit is going to likely determine the law around speech rights for pro-Palestine students for the country. All right, the final section, where I talk about Trump's fascist vision versus a real vision of hope for America. I just wanted to end on a note of what the fight for immigrant rights is about and why it's central to defeating fascism and why I've devoted my life to this cause and this movement. BAM has a statement, another long one, called Yearning to Breathe Free, BAM Declaration on Immigrant Rights. The title, Yearning to Breathe Free, comes from the poem at the base of the Statue of Liberty. We wrote this in the wake of the big marches in 2006. It's a full statement that places the fight for immigrant rights in America in the context of the history of the struggle for freedom against racism and against slavery in the United States. This extended passage I'm about to read, I think, expresses exactly why, whether we can stop the deportations now and win citizenship rights for immigrants is central to whether Trump's fascist project succeeds or whether democracy prevails. It was written nearly 20 years ago, but its contrast of how the immigrant bashers see America to how the immigrant rights movement sees America is far more relevant today when the character of America as a democracy is in peril. The immigrant bashers and this new movement for immigrant rights stand, in reality, for two counterposed visions of the future of this country, of what America stands for, what it means to be an American, and what kind of relationship America should have with the rest of the world. The immigrant bashers hanker after a return to a mythological past of an America to be preserved forever as a white man's republic. All the attacks on immigrants stem from a conception of the United States as an ivory tower of special privilege. The anti-immigrant ideologues see America as an embattled oasis of wealth and comfort, which must be fortified against the disadvantaged, oppressed, and especially non-white people of the world. Regardless of the facts, these reactionaries simply assume and assert that the growing presence in this country of large numbers of immigrants somehow threatens to undermine and topple their imaginary tower of privilege. The anti-immigrant ideologues are not only profoundly wrong and racist in their perception of the role of immigrants in America today and of the significance of immigration to the nation's future, they are, in reality, profoundly pessimistic about the future of America itself, since they define the nation in terms that both the laws of global economic development and the global struggle for every surviving progressive value of modern humanity have already consigned to the graveyard of history. In glowing contrast, the new civil rights movement, rooted as it is in the struggle of millions of immigrants for hope for their futures and the futures of their families, sees America still as a land of hope for huddled masses yearning to breathe free. The new movement therefore defines America not in terms of race, ethnicity, or the protection of power and privilege, but in terms of its historic commitment to the principles of liberty and equality. The aim of this new movement is to lead the nation to make real its claimed commitment to these principles. These are two very different visions for America. There's Donald Trump's vision, the mythological, racist, and pessimistic one, and then there is our vision, that based in actual history of regular people fighting to breathe life into the principles that this nation says it's founded on. Instead of an ivory tower fearful of losing its privilege, the immigrant communities see this as a land of hope and possibility. They are actually the ones fighting for the principles of equality. In this sense, grounded in all the best traditions of American history, The so-called illegal immigrants fighting for their freedom are easily far better Americans than their hypocritical flag-waving critics and opponents. And most immediately, because Trump's argument for authoritarianism is to allow him to carry out ethnic cleansing and mass deportations, the immigrants' fight for themselves is not really just for themselves, but it's to defend democracy in the US for all Americans. I am a gay Filipino American and a son of immigrants, and I joined BAMN when I was 18 because I knew that building a new civil rights movement was the key to my own liberation. And I knew that history would take a dark turn if there wasn't a new mass movement for equality. I knew that in Germany, not only the Jews, but also socialists and gay people and anyone that the Nazis saw as a threat to the state were scapegoated and sent off to the concentration camps, which in the conditions of World War II became extermination camps. In 2025, for fascism to succeed, it needs to defeat the mass movements. And in the United States, that means first and foremost that the immigrant communities hide in the shadows, and removing as many of the 11 million people without papers as possible. Those of us who oppose fascism and do have papers cannot wait for the people who would be among the most capable and heroic fighters for democracy to be gone before we start fighting for our own freedom. Their fate is everyone's fate. We must stop every deportation by any means necessary. And we must defend every group Trump attacks, LGBT people, women, federal workers, you name it, by any means necessary. Pastor Martin Niemöller was a Protestant priest in Germany who supported the Nazi Party when Hitler took power in 1933. He opposed the socialists and the communists for their atheism, and he thought that the Nazis would bring about a national revival. He also was anti-Semitic. However, when he joined other priests in criticizing a Nazi policy as incompatible with Christianity, the Nazis arrested him in 1937. He was sent to a concentration camp where he spent the duration of World War II, and he was nearly executed by the SS before being freed. A year after the war, he wrote the following: "First they came for the communists, and I did not speak out because I was not a communist. Then they came for the socialists, and I did not speak out because I was not a socialist. Then they came for the trade unionists, and I did not speak out because I was not a trade unionist. Then they came for the Jews, and I did not speak out because I was not a Jew. Then they came for me, and there was no one left to speak out for me." What Niemöller expresses here is the truth, that our fates are tied together. But he said it after the calamity. And today, in 2025, we have the good fortune of being able to learn from that history. And despite what doomsayers and fearmongers say, the other side hasn't won yet. We're far from it being too late to defeat the fascists. They have their president, yes, but voting is an atomized act, and the fascists here are not nearly as well organized or numerous or bold as the fascists in Germany in 1933. They are still relatively weak. And meanwhile, there are millions of immigrants and many, many young people who want to fight, who want to win, who are still here. We need new leaders who will make sure our new movement learns the lessons of history and does not repeat the same mistakes, including following the organizations and so-called leaders who are making the same mistakes today that the opposition to Hitler made in Germany in the 1930s. We can't let the death of millions of people be in vain. Never again. And si se puede.
We won't have